It's an honor and pleasure to be here for the host scientometrics is the measurement of the performance of scientists, which is a side interest of mine. I won't talk about that today. Instead, I gave myself a nice, ambitious title. I'm going to talk about the physical and transition risks of climate change. I understand that I have 1.5 hours. Don't think I will fill it all. As always, it's sort of custom at keynotes that you keep your questions to the end, but I know what I'm going to say. I'm actually much more interested in what you have to say about the topic than what I have to say, because I've heard it all before. So if you want to interrupt, that is perfectly fine with me. So, as I said, a nice and narrow subject. I'm going to start by talking about the transition risks, and then I'm going to move to the physical risks. I realize two things. One, I'm an economist addressing people who are mostly in finance. And second, some of the things that I'm going to say will come as a bit of a surprise and perhaps a shock to some of you. We now also project my voice. So let's get started. Article 2 of 2015 Paris Agreement under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change says in Article 2.1a that the intention, the aim of international climate policy is to hold the increase in the global average surface air temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and hopefully try to keep it below 1.5. That is a fairly ambitious target. It may have been inspired by pictures like these. What you're looking at here is the cost of carbon neutral electricity, or actually the sources of all electricity. And what you see in yellow is that solar power has rapidly become cheaper. It's actually now the cheapest way to make electricity. And wind, onshore and offshore, has also become a lot cheaper than it used to be. The problem with wind and solar, of course, is that it's unpredictable when it will come, and it isn't always there, so you also need to store it. But also the costs of electricity storage in the form of batteries has come down rapidly. And this seems to have sort of planted in people's minds that climate policy is going to be easy and cheap. And that may be one of the reasons why the Paris Agreement set such strict targets. But they are very strict targets. This animation shows a number of things, and it has started now. On the left, you're looking at historical emissions, and what you see is that over this period, 1980 to 2020, they've actually gone up quite steeply. And then on the right, you're looking at possible trajectories to have a good chance to keep the temperature, the global mean temperature, below 1.5 degrees. And the first scenarios that you see just work with emission reduction, and then you see just how steep emissions have to fall. The other scenarios that you're looking at make the assumption that at some point in the future, in 30 or 40 years from now, we will be able to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere at scale. At the moment, we can do it in demonstration projects, but the assumption is that in 30 years, we will be able to do it at scale. But even so, you see the sharp break in the trend in emissions. 1.5 degrees really is a tall order and requires very rapid emission reduction. And this is the transition risk that people have talked about. Transition risk is the risks imposed on the economy and the financial system by climate policy. This graph shows the relationship between, on the horizontal axis, cumulative CO2 emissions, and on the vertical axis, temperature change that we have observed. And what you see is that even though the system is highly nonlinear, really the global mean surface air temperature is roughly linear in the sum total of all CO2 ever emitted. And that is essentially because the key nonlinearities cancel, not because the system is linear, but the key nonlinearities essentially cancel out. So that makes for a relatively easy mapping from the total amount of CO2 that we have emitted and the eventual warming, but also the total amount of CO2 that we will emit and eventual warming. And that allows us to set a carbon budget. And for 2 degrees of warming, we are allowed to emit something between 1,200 and 1,500 billion tons of CO2. If we want to stick to 1.5, then we can emit maybe 500 billion tons of CO2. And we have already emitted, or at least in 2018, 850 tons of CO2. So this will tell you, no, sorry, that is not, I take back the last number. The first 2 numbers I gave you are correct. So that is where these numbers come from. You have a direct mapping, a linear mapping from the temperature target to the amount of CO2 that we can put in the atmosphere. Now that is not the point of the graphic that you're looking at. In this exercise, the authors did the following. The point of departure is that most of our CO2 emissions come from the capital stock. It's not so much our behavior, it's not sort of the consumables that we do, but really it's the buildings in which we live and work, it's the vehicles that we drive to transport ourselves and goods and commodities. And of course, it's the power plants that make electricity, right? So these are all capital goods. That is where our CO2 emissions come from. So what the authors did in this exercise for data from 2018 is that they made an inventory of all the CO2 emitting capital stock, all the power plants, all the vehicles, all the chemical industry, and so on and so forth. And obviously they did this for the world as a whole, so some parts are rather detailed and other parts are rather rough, but that is what they did. And they had the life, the age of all this infrastructure and all these capital goods. And then they made 2 assumptions. One, that these capital goods would be retired at the end of their normal economic lifetime. So that is 20 years for a car, that's 40 years for a power plant. And they assumed that these things would be run as they have always been run and emit therefore the same amount of CO2 as they always have. And if you then add up all these numbers, you come to what these authors have called committed emissions. This is the stuff that the existing capital stock would emit. And that is the picture that you see here. On your left, you're looking at it by economic sector for the world as a whole. And what you see in, I can actually do it like this. What you see in sort of the lightest blue is road transport. As I said, they assume that vehicles have a lifetime of 20 years, so that peters out rather rapidly. But they also assume that power plants have a lifetime of 40 years. So that actually takes us to 2060. No, 2018. So that is not there yet. Well, a little bit is there, but not a lot, right? And also the current data centers that power all the AI, it's a bit too early for that, right? Here in the light, I want to say gray, pinkish sort of color is the stuff that isn't operational yet, but which has planning permission, right? And then actually you take it out to 2070 before emissions return to 0. Now, if you integrate under this curve, you find that the total amount of committed emissions in 2018 was 850 billion tons of CO2. which is more than the remaining budget for 1.5 degrees. Which immediately implies that the only way to get to 1.5 degrees is to prematurely retire these assets, right? Now, that is the polite way of saying things. Really what this means is that investors will lose their shirt, right? Because you thought your power plant would operate for 40 years and that is where you made your profit, but now if climate policy, if this target is to be taken seriously, this means that you'll have to shut down your power plant after 20 years rather than the budgeted 40 years. So this really means stranded assets, bankruptcies, right? So in this picture here, we have it by economic sector or economic activity. Here we have it by country and region. And no surprises here. In Europe, where people are most enthusiastic about climate policy and stringent targets for the global mean temperature, it's actually not much of a problem, and that is because most of our capital stock is actually relatively old. But you also see this is where the bankruptcies will be. It will be in China, it will be in India, places like Indonesia. That is where the real economic pain will be. And this immediately poses a political problem. Sort of imagine that Chinese Communist Party will do this because they have sort of imposed major shocks on their own industry occasionally. They seem to become a little bit more hesitant, but maybe that operative word there is seem. And we imagine that China, or that India, which is a democracy still, or Indonesia, it's also sort of a democracy, would ever be able to do this to their own industry, I think is a bit of a stretch, right? So that is the second method that I want to give. We really take these targets seriously. We're talking about asset stranding, we're talking about bankruptcies, and we're talking about capital destruction. This picture is from the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And there's a lot of information on this graph. The different colors are different policy targets. The dark green is a strict interpretation of 1.5 degrees. This is a loose interpretation of 1.5 degrees, a strict interpretation of 2 degrees, and a loose interpretation of 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees, the eventual warming. Emission taxes, that's on the vertical axis, I should have said, in 2030, 2050, and 2100. Of course, climate policy becomes more stringent over time. And then this is the box and whisker plot. Here is the median. And then here you see individual model results. And the first thing you notice when you realize that this is a logarithmic scale is that the models actually strongly disagree with one another, what it would take to get us there. The assumption here is actually a fairly simple one, and that is that there's a global carbon tax. And if you implement this global carbon tax, you get to certain emission reduction, and that will get us to a certain temperature target. That is the, that is the assumption. Again, that is the assumption here. Now, if we focus on the loose interpretation of 1.5 degrees or the strict interpretation of 2 degrees, then what we see is that according to the median model, the carbon price, the worldwide carbon price, will need to be around $100 per ton of carbon, per ton of CO2, sorry, by the year 2030. Now, that is good news for Europe, because we are actually already there. The carbon price, when I last checked, was around 80 euros per ton of CO2. So Europe is roughly there. Last month, 3-4 weeks ago, when I made this graph, the price in China was only $8 per ton of carbon. And by the end of the decade, in 7 years' time, in order to get us on track for the Paris targets, it will need to be 100. So that is a price inflation of 39% per year in real terms, right? Not in nominal terms, in real terms. which is fairly steep, right? It's again difficult to imagine that could happen. And China is actually the easy one. This is a map of all the places in the world and all the countries in the world that have either carbon taxes or tradable permits, and in some cases both. Sometimes because they cover different sectors, and in a few cases actually there's double regulation with a tax and tradable permits. But what you see is that actually in large parts of the world, about 68% of emissions, there is no carbon price at the moment whatsoever. And whereas the green are tradable permits, the blue are carbon taxes, the striped ones are carbon taxes and tradable permits. Yeah, no, and I don't think there is a legend on the graph. And Italy only has tradable permits, as has Romania. Where was I? So for China, the problem is 40% price inflation per year for the next 7 years. For large parts of the world, it is introducing a fairly high price, right? That is what is needed for in order to meet these particular targets. And that, of course, implies rapid price inflation, energy price inflation. After all the stuff we have seen, after the second invasion of Russia of Ukraine, we will need much more of this stuff over the next 7 years. Now, I did show you a picture of the range of model results, and I said that there's actually a large range of model results, and models very strongly differ with one another about what it would cost to reduce emissions at the scale, which of course leads to the question, which of these models is best, right? And the answer is Alina Baikova, obviously, is at the moment the best model, but that is not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about energy models. And on the left-hand side of this graph, you're again looking at a range of model results, but now expressed in a different way. What you're looking at is essentially a measure of the efficacy, the effectiveness of a carbon price. And that is here defined as how much emissions do you reduce as a percentage per dollar of tax you put on carbon. And what you see is that some models are fairly optimistic. The coffee model, essentially a $1 carbon tax will give you a 5% emission reduction. Essentially, the energy sector just falls over at the slightest push of a carbon tax. Whereas other models, this is the model, the official model of the OECD, actually you see almost no response. The short-term price elasticity is essentially zero. So we see this sort of 2-3 orders of magnitude difference between the models. And then the question is, of course, which of these models is right? Now, I pointed at the two extremes, but also in between you see a fairly strong disagreement between the models. So that is, on the left-hand side, these are the models that were used by the IPCC in its latest assessment report. Climate economics is a peculiar academic field. It started in 1975 with a paper by Bill Nordhaus. And at the time that Bill wrote his first paper about the economics of climate change and the economics of greenhouse gas emission reduction, there was no climate policy. So he wrote a model, an ex-ante model, right? With two equilibria, one with climate policy and one without climate policy, and then you take the difference, right? And for reasons that I think are best explained by the conservatism of academia, is that people have kept on doing this and doing this and doing this and doing this until fairly recently. The bulk of the climate economics literature is ex ante. the bulk of the papers that look at climate policy look at future climate policy. Sort of forgetting that in 1991, Finland introduced a carbon tax. That's now more than 30 years ago. So we can actually also look at the effect of past climate policy on emissions. But people have only recently started realizing this. And I could find 5 studies only that made an ex-post estimate of the effectiveness of carbon pricing. And you see them all here. There's, again, large disagreement between these studies. But these 3 seems to be the highest quality, and they roughly agree with one another. And then if we compare the ex-post studies to the ex-ante studies, then what we find is that these 2 models are probably best. If we do a formal sort of Bayesian model averaging of the ex-ante studies using the ex-post studies as the likelihood, then we find that the posterior weight of the ECOMFIN model is 99.5%, and the posterior weight of the Gemini model is 0.5%, and the other models sort of share what remains. Which is a rather sobering message, because these 2 models are actually among the most pessimistic of the set of models used by the IPCC. Right? Which allows us to interpret this particular graph, and this is, if we're gonna take this 1.5 degrees target seriously, then the implication is that emissions have to be near 0 by 2050. Again, asset trending and so on and so forth. And the question asked in this particular graph is, what would that do to the macroeconomy? By how much would economic growth slow? Again, you see this wide range of model results. Some models say, well, this is gonna, in 2050, will make us 2% poorer. That is essentially, we will lose 1 year of economic growth over a 30-year period, a 35-year period. Oh, 2023, over 27-year period, right? Which is not such a big deal, right? The ECOMFIN model actually says, no, this is going to take 1/5 of our income by 2050. It is a much more substantial economic sacrifice. Now, if you recall the previous graph I showed, this, unfortunately, is the model that best corresponds to the data. I'm going to get there.
As a way to measure the economy, we act on something that is related to carbon reduction, but at the same point in time, we keep on using a measure of performance of the economy which doesn't keep track of sides benefit that might arise.
Absolutely, I'm going to come to that. Recall the title, Physical and Transition Risks. They're going to get to the impact of climate change a little bit later. So hold your fire, please. And there will be plenty to shoot at later. Don't worry. So the fourth point I want to make is that, yes, this is going to lead to significant and substantial deceleration of economic growth, right? Now, there is one further point I want to make, and that is a bit complicated and not something that you have heard before, most likely. This is a picture of the Leviathan tax. So if climate policy is done through a carbon tax, then the government will get a lot of revenue, right? And you may object, well, most policy is actually done through tradable permits, but if those permits are auctioned, then the government will also get a lot of revenue, right? So in that sense, carbon taxes and tradable permits are equivalent. The question then is, what would the government do with that revenue? And one of the things that the government could do with that tax revenue or that auction revenue is to reduce taxes, right? So the Leviathan tax is defined as that carbon tax or carbon price that would allow the government to abolish all other taxes, all income taxes, all VAT, all excises, and so on and so forth, right? So that is the Leviathan tax. And that is shown here on the vertical axis, again in logarithmic scale, and on the and that is done for 142 countries in the world, for which there is sufficient data. And then on the horizontal axis, we're looking at the fraction of global CO2 emissions that would be covered by this tax. The Leviathan tax is pretty high, 30,000 or more in places like Sweden and Switzerland, right? High income, low energy use. I don't know why my mouse is still there. It's pretty low in places like the Central African Republic, right, where there's actually hardly any tax collection at the moment. So any amount of tax collection would immediately change, would immediately increase the size of the public sector. But the crucial bit here is in the middle. And recall that when I said, well, we're going to hit the Paris targets, that would require a carbon tax of around $100 per ton of CO2 by the year 2030. That's actually here. And at the moment, or in 2019, and the data here are for 2019, the Leviathan tax in India and China is 95, 96, in Indonesia it's 102. That means that, yeah, Indonesia can abolish all its other taxes and replace it with a carbon tax if it is serious about hitting this, these Paris targets. And if you want to go further, right, then that immediately implies an expansion of the public sector in these countries, right? It also, of course, implies a major fiscal overhaul, right? The idea that in 7 years' time, we can abolish all taxes in the economy and replace it with a single carbon tax sounds a little bit ambitious to me. But the intention of a carbon tax is, of course, to drive emissions to zero. So what then follows is another major fiscal change, that is the income taxes that have just been abolished will have to be reintroduced, right? Which may, abolishing income taxes is probably popular with the electorate, but then reintroducing them a few decades later may run into some problems. So there's an issue there. The other two issues are on this graph. What you're looking at here is in 2050, if we're going to go for these targets, what would be the amount of taxes actually collected relative to the economy now worldwide? This is again the range of models in the IPCC. The IPCC is, of course, the gold standard, or so they claim. There is this one model where the amount of carbon tax collected is 300% of GDP. I talked to some colleagues in macro, and they don't understand this either. So if we throw away this particular model and zoom in the models that are more credible, then this is the picture that emerges. Again, there's some models that are very optimistic, right? They say, well, you can do this at a very low price, it's not going to cost us anything. But if we are focusing on the IMACLIM model, which, as I said, is the one that is closest to the data, actually the total tax bill may be around 45% of GDP, which is a huge tax bill. And if you say, well, this is going to be done through tradable permits, this is a very large economic activity, right? So for those of you who are advising your students what sort of job should you pick, well, this seems to be a safe bet, right? There is another thing that is going on. Recall that animation that I showed where we're going to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. At the moment, there is no reason to do so. The market for CO2 is saturated. There's enough bubbles in your beer. You don't need more. That market is completely saturated. The price of industrial CO2 is essentially zero. So the only reason to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere is climate policy. Either through an explicit subsidy from the government for sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, or through a system of tradable permits where you get a carbon offset and you sell the rights into the carbon market. That would be a reason to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere at the moment. Now, the assumption here is that it will be done through an explicit subsidy, but it may be an implicit subsidy. Again, the range of model results is quite astoundingly wide. If we focus on the Immerclim model again, then this would mean a subsidy of 20% of GDP, which is twice the amount we currently spend on public healthcare or on healthcare in general. Again, this poses a political problem. We're probably all relatively comfortable with us collectively spending 10% on healthcare, because we all have parents and grandparents and friends and colleagues who are ill, and we want them to be taken care of well. We all know people who work in health, and we think they deserve a decent salary. So you can sort of defend this to the electorate that we should be spending this amount of money on healthcare. And has been no big debates about this. But that is not how sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere works. This will not be the neighborhood nurse looking after your mother. This will be, the only way to keep the cost down is large-scale monoplantations in places where land is cheap. Highly mechanized, few jobs, done by large multinationals. So the plan really here is to give 20% of our income to these companies through public subsidies to do things in Kenya or in Brazil. No politician will stand on a platform for re-election with such a plan, right? So there's large fiscal transfers involved in these targets, and that of course leads to possible tax revolts. And I give you 3 examples here. One, a poll not so recently published or publicized by The Guardian. Many Europeans want climate action, but less so if it changes their lifestyle. The picture that you see here is the yellow vests in, I believe it's Paris, somewhere in France, right? This is when Macron tried to introduce a fairly modest carbon tax. Not a high one, not a very substantial one, but of course he did not succeed because of social protest. The other thing that you see here is the results of recent elections in the Netherlands, where a single issue protest party sort of jumped from nothing to being one of the largest parties in the Senate. And the single issue was essentially about nitrogen policy. And the transition needed to get rid of nitrogen is much, much smaller than the transition needed for carbon dioxide, right? So no, I don't think this will be feasible. Everything that I've said would lead to this conclusion. Now, why do I say these things to an audience of people who are mostly working in finance? If I look at the finance literature on transition risks and what it will do to the stocks and the stock prices and financial positions of companies and so on and so forth, then the assumption is always that these risks are exogenous. That this is something that is imposed on us by some all-powerful dictator, and as companies, we just have to suck it up. I think that is entirely the wrong way of looking at transition risks. Because these are self-imposed. the governments that impose that on the economy can be lobbied, they can be voted out, they can be overthrown. And really what you're measuring is not something that is imposed on these companies, but what you're measuring is the equilibrium between the government wanting to impose things and the lobbying effort, let's keep it polite, of the companies trying to resist it, right? Which is a completely different thing you're measuring, right? It's not something that comes from up high. And that is, I think, the takeaway message. And if you believe the things that I said before, then definitely for these very stringent targets, chances are that these things will not be imposed because somebody will realize, no, we're not going to do this. And we see already sort of Germany, of all places, heavy protests against the current government and its plans for rapid emission reduction. Okay, that was chapter 1. Now, to the questions, is it worth it, right? And what are the implications of climate change, the so-called physical risks of climate change? Again, a lot of material to go through. The starting point is this particular graph, which always confuses a lot of people. On the horizontal axis, you're looking at scenarios of climate change, here indexed by the change in the global mean surface air temperature, where 0 is pre-industrial temperatures. This is not because we think that temperature is the most important thing, but this is just an indicator for the severity of climate change, right? On the vertical axis, you're looking at the Higgsian equivalent variation, right? For those who forgot what that is, essentially what this means, and if we focus for a moment on 2.5 degrees of warming, this should be read as if the world were to warm by 2.5 degrees, then the average person would feel as if she had lost 2% of her income, 1.7% of her income. That's the average of the numbers that you see here. So that is how you should read the graph. Then there's 59 dots on the graph. Percentage of income. These are yes. These are comparative static estimates. I'll get to the dynamics later. So there's 59 dots on this graph. There's 3 that sort of dropped off at the extreme warming end. From 39 papers using 4 different types of methods. And there's a couple of things that you see, and the first thing that immediately jumps at you is that the results are all over the place, right? People just cannot agree on this. And that is perhaps understandable here. A little bit of warming, will that be good or bad for the economy? These studies here that show benefits for very substantial warming, that strikes me as odd, right? This particular estimate gets to these substantial benefits by an assumption of perfect factor mobility, right? That is, they do not only assume that capital is perfectly mobile across the world, but they also assume that labor is mobile across the world. And some people have dubbed this the Into Siberia paper, because essentially the assumption is that we're all going to move to Siberia, where the climate will be rather pleasant in the foreseeable future. But politically, you can sort of like see, well, perhaps that is not the most realistic assumption, but that is what drives these very large benefits. Whereas other studies suggest, no, 4 degrees of warming will be much more worrisome for the economy. So a large range of results, enormous uncertainty about what this would mean. But if we sort of like focus on the middle of the road estimates, then we get a different picture. The gray curve that you see here is again a Bayesian model average. 7 different impact functions were fitted to this data, and then this is sort of slightly nonlinear, slightly more than linear curve that sort of describes the middle. If we use this curve to project everything to 2.5 degrees, and then the following histogram would emerge, which I think is much clearer in its interpretation. And what you see is that the bulk of the estimates are somewhere between 0 and -2. And this is 2.5 degrees of warming, so this is 60, 80 years in the future. Essentially, what these studies say is that a century of climate change is about as bad as losing 1 year of economic growth, right? Now, that is not the message that you get in the media. Go ahead. Academics, eh? This is sort of comparative static, controlled experiment. The only thing that is changing is the climate. I'll get back to that assumption as well. So this is compared to current income, yes. Go ahead.
Obviously, in terms of the increase in temperature, not maybe in terms of other variables such as maybe the dispersion, not only how much is it going to increase as a mean, but in terms of the dispersion, or maybe like the rise of sea level. Are all these works based on the temperature?
As I said, there's 39 papers that do it all differently. So some of these models indeed are fairly simplistic. The temperature is the only thing that's changing, and it's the mean temperature that is the only thing that is changing. Other models include a lot of detail about how rainfall changes and include changes in storminess and sea level rise and all those things. But yeah, this is not the place to take you through all 39 papers, right? Nor would I be able to from the top of my head. So, the central estimate is actually relatively modest, right? You see 2 other things. One is that the spread is quite wide, so there's a lot of risk involved. What you also see is that the uncertainty is skewed the wrong way. That is, negative surprises are much more likely than positive surprises. And there's, of course, something we should keep in mind, right? We should not just focus on the mode. So that is the first message here. Now, I showed you these 59 dots. Another thing you can do, apart from a Bayesian model average, is to just fit bivariate kernel to this, and then this is the picture that you see, which is not very insightful. Then you could look at the conditional CDFs for 3 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 1.5 degree of warming. And what you see is essentially a lot of overlap, but it's not particularly insightful either because of the almost perfect correlation between these scenarios. So you can also take the difference, and in this case, it's the difference between taking warming from 3 degrees to 2.5 degrees. And these would essentially be the benefits of climate policy at a global average. You see there's a small possibility that this will actually do harm, but the probability of that is 2-3%. But most of it is actually, yes, this would be a real benefit. You also see is that this will be a modest benefit, sort of 0.5, perhaps 0.6, 0.7% of income. So the question, is it worth it? If we just focus on what happens at the global average, is, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, but chances are it will be a small benefit. Now, this is the state of the literature as it used to be. This is basically Bill Nordhaus's Nobel Prize. People have challenged that. And the main challenge comes from these guys here, Marshall Berg, Solly Sheng, and Ted Miguel. And here we're not looking at sort of comparative static, but people have said we're gonna build dynamic models, right? And it's all econometric work. The problem with the earlier studies, some of it were econometric, but that essentially they were cross-sectional or panel regressions of income levels or levels of other economic activities on rainfall and temperature and those sort of things. And they were essentially cross-sections or panel studies. The problem with sort of like trying to do this in time series is that the period for which we have good economic data, say from 1960 to 2020 or so, climate actually hasn't changed that much. Other things have changed considerably over that period, so you have a very weak signal over time. You have a much stronger signal over space. Climate varies much more over space than it has done over time in the last 60 years. But also there's all sorts of confounders. So these sort of studies that directly regress some indicator of economic income or economic activity on the average temperature and average rainfall just run into all sorts of econometric problems immediately because confounding variables essentially. So what people have done is say, well, let's not look at climate, the average temperature and the average rainfall, but let's look at weather. So either annual or monthly or even daily temperature and rainfall records. And let's just regress things on that with the assumption, of course, that climate change will manifest itself as future weather that will be different from today's weather, right? So there's 12 studies that have done this, as far as I know. And 8 of them are shown here, and they all use the specification that you see here. The change in per capita income, so this is a measure of economic growth, is a function of the temperature, the level of temperature. And if you run these regressions and then project this into the future, these are the results that you get, according to the 8 different studies. And what you see is that these results are all over the place, right? You again see this enormous range of effect sizes, as well as differences in signs. And realize that it cannot be fully read here. 1 degree of warming up to 6 degrees of warming, right? And there's actually 2 studies that say that the impact will start turning negative only beyond 6 degrees of warming, which I hope we will never get to. Also intriguingly, if you then take the weighted average of these studies, then you actually get this line, which is almost identical to the very first study that did this by Melissa Dell and the 2 Bens, right? And this is just testament to the quality of Melissa's work. The problem with this particular specification is that it's peculiar. It's theoretically strange, because essentially what you do is you regress a change on a level, a flow on a stock. That is something that if you ever paid attention during most of you are finance professors, so you did pay attention. That's something that you shouldn't do. Changes depend on changes, stocks depend on stocks, but not stocks and flow mix and changes and levels mix. But that is essentially what is done. This implies, of course, that in the very long run, should we stop climate change at some future point of warming, say 2 degrees or 3 degrees, that these economic effects will not go away. Economic growth will be permanently lowered. Now, any growth model in macros since Harold Domer would tell you that is not how economic growth works. That is not what drives the permanent growth rate of the economy. But that is what these people have assumed, peculiarly.
Some kind of threshold that you are putting, it's like.
No, that's just the range.
Just to show the practice.
That's essentially the most pessimistic model plus minus its standard deviation, and the most optimistic model plus its standard deviation. Standard error, I should say. Now, if we believe these models, actually economic growth or the economic impact of climate change will be very substantial, right? What I did not tell you is what is on the vertical axis here. That's the change in the annual growth rate in percentage points, right? Where they sort of say, well, this is going to knock 1% of economic growth every year, right? This is much larger than knocking 1% of income in 100 years' time, right? This is knocking 1% of growth every year. This most pessimistic model here says, no, we're going to knock 4% of economic growth every year. Growth rate of the economy is around 2% per capita terms. So this is going to lead to economic shrink of 2% per year, right? So these are very large effects that these models predict, right? And that is, at the moment, the major challenge to the Nordhaus story that I gave you earlier. As I said, there were 12 studies that do this. Here are the other 4, which use a different specification. That is, the change in income, the growth rate of the economy, is a function of the change in temperature, which you at least think is the more satisfactory specification. Again, you see a wide range of model results. But the most important thing is that the vertical axis is changed, not in its concept. It's still the change in the average growth rate of per capita income. But now that is measured in hundreds of percent rather than in percent points. Right? This is an effect size that is 2 orders of magnitude smaller. Which of course begs the question, which of the 2 models, which of the 2 specifications is the correct one? Now, Brian Prest and colleagues have come to the rescue here. And what they did is they did a cross-validation. They took 800 model specifications, estimated them, withheld a fraction of the data, and see whether they could forecast that fraction of the data. Up to 20% of the data were withheld. They estimated 400 versions of each of the 2 specifications, which you can read here, right? These are the 400 specifications. This is the models where the economic growth is affected by the temperature level. This is where economic growth is affected by the change in temperature. And for those of you with eyesight that is roughly on par with me, here the scale runs from -100 to 100, right? Here the scale runs from -6 to 2, right? So there is indeed 2 orders of magnitude difference between the effect size. And here we see all 400 specifications and the other 400 specifications, and then the colored ones are the ones that actually pass the validation test, right? Whatever root mean square error that is actually acceptable. And what they find is what most econometricians in the room would expect, that the second specification, where the change depends on the change, the flow depends on the flow, actually passes the cross-validation test much more readily. And the reason for this is that if you regress the growth rate on the level of temperature, then essentially your country fixed effects will have to compensate for this and will have to do a lot of work. And of course, in a cross-validation, those country effects country fixed effects disappear, right? For the countries that were excluded from your data set. So that is the intuitive reason that you did not estimate your country fixed effects to offset the initial temperature effect, and that is why your forecasts just go all over the place. So the theoretically and econometrically more sound estimates are far less pessimistic, right? So now to put it all back together, here we're looking at the implications. I showed you this recently, I showed you this recently, I showed you this one a little while ago. These are the comparative statics, these are the two empirical studies. Of course, if you have the comparative static effects, then that implies effects on economic growth, right? If the comparative static says your economy will be 1% smaller than it otherwise would have been, that then also roughly implies that your investment will be 1% smaller than it otherwise would have been, and that means that you have less capital stock, and that means that you have a knock-on effect in the next year, right? So if you pull these comparative static effects through a solo growth model, then you have an implied impact on economic growth, and then you can directly compare it to the econometric studies, right? And that is what is done here. Again, you see the order of magnitude difference between growth on growth, growth on level. If we sort of take this one out, then what we find is that these earlier comparative static estimates are actually much in line with what I think are the theoretically and econometrically sound dynamic studies, right? Empirical studies. So the very first method that I gave you, the sort of Nordhaus methods, yes, there are benefits to climate policy, but they're not very large. Holds, I think, but you're right. You're perfectly justified to shout at me later. Final points I want to make. I have focused so far on the average impact. This is a bit silly because nobody is interested in what happens to the average person on the planet. People want to know what happens to me or the people around me. So if I need to go back a good bit. If I go back to these studies, this is all the global average, but a whole bunch of them actually have regional detail. And with a good bit of interpolation and imputation, you can come up with a very similar picture, all for 2.5 degrees of warming. Now, instead of looking at sort of through time or through temperature space, or through climate space, we're looking at it through income space. So on the vertical axis, we still have the Higgs equivalent variation, the welfare equivalent income chains. On the horizontal axis, we now have per capita income in the year 2015, and this is for all, or for 200 or so countries in the world. Not all of them are in there. And again, you are struck by the uncertainty around this, and this is only the 67% confidence interval. But you also see the point that I actually want to talk about, and that is that the negative impacts are very much concentrated in poorer countries. Richer countries see small damages or even benefits of warming, but poorer countries see much larger negative economic impacts. For those of you who wonder, like I showed you that the world average was a few percent of GDP, but here we actually see the bulk of countries falling below 10%. That is, of course, because if you aggregate across the world in dollar terms, the poor guys and girls don't count, right? We focus very much on what happens to the rich part of the world if we add up dollars rather than people. So that is why these numbers look so very different. Now, you see this strong negative correlation between income level or level of development and vulnerability to climate change. And there are three basic reasons for this. The first is exposure. Rich people work in finance or in publishing, that is, they sit in offices, air-conditioned, they drive home or take the bus home or the train, and actually spend very little time outdoors, and it's actually their choice when they spend time outdoors. So they're not much exposed to the weather and the climate, right? In poorer countries, most workers and a very large share of the economy is in agriculture. And that means they are directly exposed to rainfall and temperature, right? So simply the structure of the economy means that poorer economies are more exposed and therefore more vulnerable to climate change. And that is what you see here. The second reason, and what I did here is that I changed the horizontal axis from current per capita income to current average temperature, is not surprising. Hotter countries are much more vulnerable to climate change than colder countries, and colder countries actually see mostly benefits of warming. No surprises there. This is partly to do with the biophysical systems that we rely on. And it's partly to do with adaptation. If you live in, actually I did not look up the temperature of Budapest, the average temperature of Budapest. But if you live in Paris or in London and you wonder what will 2 degrees of warming do to you, essentially from London it will take you to Bordeaux or Marseille, right? And if you wonder how should I adapt to climate change, if I live in London, then you say, well, what do people in Barcelona, what do people in Marseille do? Right? And they eat at different times and they dress differently, partly to do with sense of fashion, and partly to do with climate. They have buildings that keep the heat out rather than the heat in, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a whole range of adaptations to climate that you can do, and you can just copy that from what people in the Mediterranean do if you live in Northern Europe. If you live in the hottest city on earth, in Jacobabad or in Dar es Salaam or in Singapore, you can't copy other people's behavior and other people's technology. You have to invent these adaptations from scratch, which is much more difficult. So that is one reason or another reason why hotter places are more vulnerable to climate change than poorer places. And of course, it just so happens, or maybe there's a causal relationship, that hot countries tend to be poor and poor countries tend to be hot, right? The third reason, and I switched the axis back to per capita income, is what is known in the literature as adaptive capacity. That is the ability to adapt. And some adaptation to climate change is fairly simple and is essentially private and individual. If it gets warmer, you should not wear your winter coat, right? That is something that you can figure out for yourself. That is an easy adaptation. Or you should change your diet or things like that. You should switch, eat more pasta and more salad. That is relatively straightforward. But other parts of adaptation to climate change are public interventions. And one clear example of that is protection of coasts against sea level. In most countries, this is seen as a task of the government, and it is actually a large infrastructure project. So that means that if you want to be protected against sea level rise, then what you need is a government that is able to raise taxes. You need a government that is able to use those taxes to hire the engineers and construction workers to start building dikes. And of course, they do not only need to be technically capable of doing so, but also the transition or from the tax collection to actually spending means that no money is leaked to Swiss bank accounts or mansions in London. So you need a basically non-corrupt and capable government. And of course you need a government that cares about its people. And one of the reasons that people think Bangladesh is so very vulnerable to sea level rise is because essentially the political elites, the powers that be in Bangladesh, are not really accountable to the people. They can just bribe them by giving them a t-shirt or a stack of rice and they will vote for you. And of course the elites in Bangladesh are not particularly vulnerable themselves because they live either in the hills of Dhaka or they live in London, right? So they don't care. And that is what is known as adaptive capacity, to having the economic means to protect yourself, to having a government that can mobilize and effectively use those economic means, and then deploy the right technologies. And of course, you need to have a government that actually wants to do this. And all of these things are both symptoms and causes of underdevelopment. Right? So adaptive capacity is lower in poorer countries, and that is why they are so very vulnerable. I gave the example with sea level rise. You can do the same thing with healthcare systems, right? A lot of the problems with climate change have to do with the spread of tropical diseases and those sort of things. Again, you need public health interventions to stop this. Which, of course, then implies that these physical risks of climate change are also to a degree endogenous. People sort of see climate change as something that is imposed on us by the actions of our parents and grandparents, and future climate change is stuff that we do to our children and grandchildren. But of course, both the structure of the economy is not something that just happens, right? That's something that we have control over to a degree. But also adaptation is human agency. This is something that we control to a degree. So also these physical risks are endogenous to the system. I've said all this. I've also said all this. So I can turn it over to you with 20 minutes left. So these are the two things I've said. Transition risks of climate policy are substantial. If we are talking about trying to meet the Paris targets, of course, if we replace the Paris targets with less ambitious targets, then a lot of the problems that I talked about will very rapidly disappear. The physical risks of climate change are, I would argue, less substantial, but also less endogenous. I sort of said, well, you can shape these to a certain extent, but of course, we cannot control climate. We can only control climate 30, 40 years from now. We cannot control today's climate yet. People are working on that. That's all I wanted to say. Over to you.
Well, about physical risks, now you have pointed out the idea of poor countries are more affected. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on why not the richer countries may not be affected, because of the poorest countries are those that are exporting the raw materials, the agriculture, materials and goods to developed countries, and also the migration of poorer countries to more developed countries that could affect economic growth in those developed economies. So the interrelation between poorer countries and richer countries, I think is something relevant, no?
Absolutely. I don't think the literature has a good handle on this. I mean, in some of the studies that I showed, there was actually in the The clouds of impact that I showed there are CGE studies. Here they are. Computer general equilibrium that sort of like do take these things into account to a certain extent, but not value chains and all that sort of thing. And what we have seen in recent years, the not so recent, the floods in Southeast Asia that sort of upset production chains all over the world, right? You may also worry about such things as heat waves and everything, and what that does to labor productivity. I think that in general, the old saying is still true, that if the US sneezes, then Canada catches a cold, right? I think that is still true to a certain extent, that the spillovers from the rich parts of the world to the poorer parts of the world are stronger than the other way around. What is of course also true is that many of these things are also malleable, right? So if you are, say, in textiles, and you have a lot of workers in Vietnam and Bangladesh, and you worry about unbearable heat and slowing your workers down, or maybe they drop dead, which is a real risk if your body overheats. The answer is put in air conditioning, right? Or that would be my preferred answer. The answer that a lot of companies have done in the wake of the Southeast Asia floods on, I believe, the Mekong is diversify. To make sure that you have your factory in different places that would not all be affected by the same hazard, which sort of like takes away the spillover effect, right? So yes, they are there. No, they're not properly accounted for, but they also can be mitigated to a large extent. There was another question in what you said, but I forgot it, sorry.
You are already covered, because social movements are also very relevant, no? Migration of people that are not able to live in those poor countries.
Migration is the other thing that people always talk about. I want to say two things about this. One, people in Africa want to leave anyway. They don't need encouragement from climate change to want to leave their places. If you look at surveys there, then the majority wants to emigrate, but is not able to because they're too poor to pay for the fare, and they cannot convince people to give them a legal route into Europe and North America. The second thing is that we are very good at keeping them out. What we're doing at the moment is essentially filling up the Mediterranean with dead bodies, right? We're very good at keeping them out. And I don't see how climate change, there will be an increase in the number of people that want to leave, but at the same time, deterioration in living standards will mean a reduction of the people that are able to leave. And I think our response will be to build a higher wall and dig a deeper moat, rather than that we will be forced to take in lots of migrants. I see your point. Yours first and then read it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for this. I would have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to focus on what I think is important. So you talked in the first part about the cost of climate change, and my overall issue with that is always that I just don't understand what we can mean by the cost of climate change. So there are some obvious parts. You talked about direct air capture, which is kind of can be seen as an unproductive investment, but then there are a lot of things where it's not really a cost that we are talking about, rather an investment, I think.
Government climate policy. Yeah. I adopted this title from what is the current norm, right? transition risks of climate change are the costs of climate policy. Nothing to do with climate change, climate policy. Yes, they are an investment, absolutely. But really what the cost here is that you force particularly the energy sector, but also in the future the transport sector and the agricultural sector, is you force these companies and the people that work there and the people that depend on that to do things differently than they would have out of their own volition. Right? So if you think back, micro 101, you have an optimizing agent, maximizing profits, maximizing utility, and then you impose an additional constraint, namely you cannot emit so much or you have to cut your emissions by a certain amount, or we impose a price on your waste that used to be free. Then optimization by Lagrange would automatically lead to a lower optimum, right? If it is a constraint that binds. And that is what an economist would see as the cost. It's not exactly how people measure it. But essentially, when you say, well, emissions used to be free and unconstrained, now emissions have to be paid for or are constrained, that means that you can generate less income, and that counts as a cost. And yes, a lot of that comes as an investment that you otherwise would not have made, but that is a matter of definition and semantics. Does that answer the question? Yes, they start negative if you ask engineers, right? They don't start negative. If it were really be possible to make money and reduce emissions at the same time, then what is keeping you, right? It doesn't make any sense to assume that the marginal abatement costs are negative. Those assumptions or those results only pop up if you make peculiar assumptions about human behavior, or more often, you make peculiar assumptions about the state of technology. Right. Rita was first and then you.
Two curiosity. One, there is only one out of the 39 papers results that there is a negative reduction of temperature and also is affecting negatively. It's just curious that is any relatively busy. And the second question is, I don't know, is there any relation between the fact that poorest countries are all located where the temperature, of course most of them are, and there is any, thing that is affecting also? I don't know, it was just...
A small question and a big question, right? The small question is very simple. The very first study looking at the economic impacts of climate change was done in 1978, or published in 1978 by Ralph Darch. At the time, the concern was about global cooling. So that is why he looked at that. Now, hot countries are poor, poor countries are hot. Is this a correlation or causation? 9 minutes till coffee break, right? There is a large literature on this, starting with Master Guan in China in the 8th century BC. And until the late 19th century, people indeed thought that, yes, this is a causal relationship. And actually, all the writers throughout 3,000 years of history said, well, the country in which I grew up, or the climate in which I grew up, is the best. And they grew up in very different climates. But yeah, they really thought that, I mean, if you read the ancient Greeks, that Italians are stupid because their climate is stupid, right? That is what the ancient Greeks thought. And for people who are not from Italy, they thought the same about you. That completely changed, of course, after World War II, where everybody said, no, 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 institutions rule, and the only thing that matters is what humans do to other humans. Climate is irrelevant. And if you believe people like Danny Roderick or Bill Easterly or Darren Acemoglu, the giants of economic growth theory, they say no, institutions rule. The only thing that matters is that. I think that pendulum has swung back a little bit, and now people say, yeah, there is a part of the reason that poor countries are poor has to do with climate. And one of the, I think, more credible stories there is that if you live in a tropical climate, you have a tropical disease regime. The risk of malaria and what that does to the mortality of your children means that you probably have more children than you would really want because the risk of them dying prematurely is so large, which then means that you don't have the money and means to invest in their health care and their education, so they grow up to be poor. And that there seems to be, and if you listen to somebody like Jeff Sachs, and some people are allergic to that name, but also if you listen to somebody like Odette Galore, they say climate does play a part, and it's part of the reasons why poor countries are poor. With immediate, yes and no. If you believe Jeff Sachs, then it's mostly through things such as diseases, and therefore through healthcare, so it's something we can control. Whereas if you believe Odette Galore or Marcella Aslan, then it is something that happened in the deep past and shaped our culture rather than that it really constrains. And of course, cultures are malleable as well. Also, the transition to climate change is debatable. But of course, if it is true that because of climate change, more people will be trapped in poverty, then it's not the difference between does my economy grow by 2% or 1.9% per year, but then the difference is does my economy grow or not, right? Which is a much larger impact. We can talk about this for a very long time. I have a question here, a question there.
Thank you so much for the inspirational keynote talk. I totally agree that somehow the finance professors and the finance academia is somewhat confused all the time. It took quite a long to step in and to start to really enter into proper type of research. So that has to be, my first question is, there has to be some probably lights in the tunnel, and what are the current future development? And the second, a little bit more specific, one of the biggest issues in finance, and this one is not only at the market regulators or at the state and federal level, is the greenwashing. So is there any way you can identify a axiomatic type of approach to address the issue and to provide guidance about improving our understanding in the watchdog, just to generate a uniform system of detecting this one. So it's a really maybe linked to transparency, linked to awareness, and to finish on the high note, I'm very confident that, and coming from Australia, Australia was the last one to join the movement towards the transition to zero. We have a momentum now, and that momentum probably is very important to be keep and to do it really well.
Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Let's start with that one. I think there is. I've been working in climate chains for 30 years now. We did not see this coming. If you sort of like read back to what I wrote 30 years ago, or listen to lectures I gave then, that's probably not possible. Then nobody saw the rapid decline in the cost of renewables coming. I shouldn't say nobody, hardly anybody. And it's not just the cost of renewables, electrification of transport turns out to be easier than we thought. Electrification of heating turns out to be easier than we thought. This is not to say that you can hit the 2 degrees target. That is probably infeasible for a whole range of reasons. But whereas 30 years ago we worried about 4 or 6 or 8 degrees of warming, no, given how rapidly these technologies have developed, I mean, the cheapest way to make electricity at the moment is by solar. I spoke to a colleague from China a while ago, and she told me that the only reason that they're still building coal is because the coal lobby is so powerful, not because it makes economic sense. Now, that can last for a while, but not forever, right? So, that I think is what will eventually solve the climate problem. And of course, you don't need policy for this. You need policy to develop these technologies and make them cheaper. But once somebody offers you a product that is cheaper and more convenient, man, you buy it, right? You actually don't care whether it emits CO2 or not. But if it's cheaper and more convenient and it doesn't happen to emit CO2, then you would buy it, right? So that is, I think, where the solution to the climate problem will come from. More from a technology push than anything else. Now, you also talked about greenwashing, which is not at all my field. There are 2 problems there. One, as you rightly point out, there is just no standardization or hardly any standardization. And that means that every company writes this up differently, and it's very difficult to make sense of this. I actually teach this in my undergraduate class in environmental economics, where we look at corporate accounting of pressures they put on the environment, and we go through the annual reports, the annual environment reports, and they're just all over the place, right? If you go through the financial reports, there's comparable numbers, right? And you guys probably have an opinion whether this is the right set of numbers, yes or no, but at least they're comparable. If you look at the environmental accounts, they're just all over the place, right? So that is a problem. And that then, of course, immediately permits greenwashing, right? And that makes a lot of sense. If you want to keep your clients and your workers happy and your investors happy, then you've got to pretend to be better for the environment than you really are. And because there's no standardization of reporting, you can get away with it. Now, just last week, I attended a lecture by somebody whose name completely escapes me, so that is no help to you. He actually convinced the audience, including me, that this company called Regenerative, that produces a lot of these sort of standardized environmental measures of companies, that they are cooking the books. And that is actually in their interest because they make money from selling environmental accounts to companies. And of course, their incentive is to tell these companies they're doing well, because then next year they'll come back to you. So that suggests that the problem is not just greenwashing and the lack of standardization, but that there's actually corruption at the heart of the few attempts at standardization that are there. So the problem may be bigger than you thought. And the answer is that the government or the regulators should step in and say, well, this is how we're going to measure this. Essentially, it's a public good problem, right? I think you're the final question.
I hope it won't take too long. No, my general takeaway from this was that if I take the globally dollar-weighted benefit of climate-based policy, it does not offset the cost. I mean, you could say, okay, maybe this is, but this is kind of the general takeaway from that. But then you showed this graph in the beginning with the capital stock that is already invested, the CO2 stock. And it showed that China, India, you said Indonesia were those who are going to emit a lot. So should we just zoom into those countries and say, okay, what would the benefit be for them, rather than look at it globally weighted with US GDP really dominating or Western GDP really dominating and the impact on them being, let's say, not as high as in those countries. So those countries should have a high interest because they see lots of the GDP in China is generated at sea level. So sea level rise is a problem. I don't know how much of this has been considered in any of these studies that look at temperature change, maybe look at agriculture, I don't look at pathogens at sea level. The other thing is India will be facing heat wave temperature if they go above 1.5, which makes large swaths of the country inhabitable. So if we zoom into those countries, how would these figures look like then for them? I mean, would they come out with a positive balance or would it still be a negative? Would they still say, okay, well, it's not worth it for us to do anything about it, is to write off or depreciate all these coal-fired power plants that we have built up and all the cars that we have?
You're absolutely right. I mean, we in Europe are terribly concerned about climate change, but our contribution is actually small and shrinking. Solution to the climate problem lies in India and China, first and foremost. China does a lot of greenwashing about this. At one level, they are concerned, and another level, they're actually more worried about economic growth. One of the things that people do not, I mean, there's also geopolitical issues there. China really wants to be energy independent, which on the one hand drives a lot of investment in wind and solar in China. On the other hand, also drives investment in underground coal gasification there, and as well as coal liquefaction. Problem with China, the problem with armies is that they use a lot of fuel. The tanks are very heavy. And if the US would block the Straits of Malacca, then the Chinese army would come to a standstill within 3 months because they've run out of diesel. So China invests a lot in coal liquefaction. Also, as a way of becoming energy independent, they invest a lot in coal gasification, which is more CO2 intensive than just burning the coal directly. China sort of takes this dual position, right? They're also very worried about climate change, not so much because of sea level rise, because the traditional view in China is that they're actually a little bit away from the coast. That is a traditional view that actually doesn't quite match up the effects on the ground, because they've built so much towards the sea. Also very good engineers, actually. So wouldn't worry too much about that. The major concern for China is that it's essentially a desert watered by the rains over the Tibetan plateau. And then these big rivers take the water to China, and that is essentially how they feed themselves. Some climate models see the rains over the Tibetan plateau failing, and that means that China would turn into a proper desert in the future. And that is probably a bigger risk than sea level rise to the country. So China is sort of in two minds about this. Yes, climate change is a problem for us, but yes, we also don't want to really solve it. Indonesia is, as far as I know, just focused on economic growth. They're very vulnerable to climate change because they're hot and it's an archipelago, right? Just islands. And everything is on the coast, essentially. In Indonesia, almost everything is on the coast. India, too, is very vulnerable to climate change. But the emphasis is on growth at all costs. Yeah, they haven't really internalized. Definitely India and Indonesia haven't internalized, whereas China is sort of like trying to do both. No, I would totally agree with you, but I am just saying, well, this is what I observe, right? I mean, the heavy reliance of India on coal is not just a long-term issue, but also all the air pollution that it causes is a short-term issue as well, right? But Mr. Modi does not take lessons from foreigners, right? So there's very little we can do about it. Now they are waking up to this. China more so than India. I'm currently involved in a project to estimate the impact, the economic impact of climate change on China, which is directly sponsored by the central government. So they are waking up to these risks, but slowly, right? If you look at, if you're a mid-level administrator in China, you look at your promotion criteria, then first and foremost is, did you deliver economic growth? Environment is there as well, but it's a small criterion. Coffee break? Yes.